hands you a child whose entire life, everything they want in this world has been crammed into a single black plastic garbage bag, is only a few dollars a day. That's a few dollars a day, not an hour. My wife and I, we do that work for 9 years. A 70-year-old grandmother is completely unequipped and unsupported to handle the violent outbursts or intense medical realities of a traumatized social needs toddler. They love them to death, but they are running on absolute empty. Out of all the children who came to our home over 9 years, every single one of them suffered from FASD. Actually, except maybe one. If you're in it for money, you are not just financially confused, you are a danger to your child, and nobody's getting paid enough to fake it. There is a number buried in Alberta's own foster care pay schedule that I want you to sit with for a second. Besides covering a child's basic needs, like a food and clothes, the actual extra pay for Respite foster family is only a few dollars a day. That's a few dollars a day, not an hour. My wife and I, we do that work for 9 years. Respite care. The placements nobody else could hold for a weekend or a week, or sometimes a little longer than that. Kids in crisis, kids between homes, kids whose regular foster family had to hit a wall and needed a breathe before they broke. And I tell you the truth right at the top. If you came into that work for that money, you would have quit in the first month. And if you stayed in it for the money, if that's what kept you showing up, then you were never fit to be there in the first place. Because somewhere in that arrangement, there is a child who has already had one adult look at them and see a transaction instead of a person. The very last thing that kid needs is another one. This is moral economy. We live in a time where people are working harder than ever and falling further behind, where families feel more pressure even when they're doing it right, where the gap between the effort and outcome has never been wider, and nobody explains why. This podcast exists to close that gap, to take that intersectional money, family, and values and talk about it like adults, not with a political spin, not with a financial jargon designed to make you feel small. Just a clear thinking from someone who has lived the pressure, done the work, and it refuses to pretend the system is the same as it was. Because economics is not just a number on a government report. It is a dinner table argument you did not want to have. It is 2 in the morning moment when you look at a ceiling and wonder if you made the right choices. It is exhaustion that has nothing to do with laziness. This is Moral Economy Talk. I'm your host, Aleksandar Balta. Let's get into it. Today, I'm talking about something my wife and I were inside of for 9 years, and we still are. Not as the kids who grew up in the system. As adults, the system cooled when nobody could take the placement. So I want to start by being clear about what respite foster care actually is. Because most people picture foster care as one thing. Kid moves in with a family, long term, maybe gets adopted. Roll credits, and that happens, and this is real. But that's not mostly what we did. Respite is emergency valve of the entire system. Look at it this way. A regular foster family hits the wall, burnout, a crisis of their own. A child is in active crisis who needs more support that they can give that particular week. And respite families take that handoff. We do sometimes for the weekend, sometimes it stretches into months. You get a call, sometimes with a few hours' notice, and child you have never met in your life is about to be standing in your front hallway holding everything they could carry. It is, I think, one of the least visible and most demanding roles in a whole child welfare system. The long term foster families get acknowledged a little. Respite families are people behind the people. The relief valve nobody sees. And we did that, my wife and I, for 9 years in Alberta, and we're still doing it. We didn't just set out to do this casually. When my wife and I first decided to look into the foster care, we have to go through a massive government gauntlet. Everybody knows that. We had to submit mountains of bureaucratic paperwork, background checks, criminal record police checks. They put us through intense interviews and handed us a psychological evaluation with over 100 questions. And then at the time, it felt completely overwhelming. You sit there thinking, why are they digging this deep into our lives just for us to watch and help some kids? It's babysitting. It felt like endless red tape. But now, looking back, forcing us to sit with family therapists was actually the best thing that ever happened to us. It forced us to look each other in the eye during a very long, heavy nights and ask a real question. Are we actually fit to do this? Are we mentally and emotionally capable of holding this weight? We were looking at the world where you see these vulnerable children screaming for help every single day, and we want to do something about it. We had to dig incredibly deep into our faith. We prayed to God to show us the light, to guide us to dark parts of this system, and to give us strength to make child's life generally better. Through that faith, we got on the exact same page. What started as a mountain of bureaucratic paperwork ended up being a foundational blessing for our marriage and our home. I want to tell you all of this up front for one reason. Everything I say for the rest of the hour, I'm saying as someone who carried it, not someone who read about it. The numbers I'm going to give you, and there will be numbers because there's still that kind of a show. I went and verified every one of them, so they're both proof, but the numbers are a small part of this episode. The big part is what 9 years of this actually taught me about the kids, about money, about family, and about what we owe to the people who get dealt the worst possible opening hand and had no say in any of it. Let's go back to the number from the cold opening because I want it on the record properly. In Alberta, foster care compensation is not a wage. It structures a per diem, a daily reimbursement meant to cover what the child actually costs to raise. Food, clothing, school supplies, the, you know, the basics for every kid. And on top of that, respite caregivers get a small relief stipend. A recent provincial rate schedule put that a few dollars a day, not an hourly wage. Few dollars a day for the caregivers who are often taking the hardest, latest predictable placements in the entire system. I want you to read that twice if you have to, because I want to kill the myth before this episode goes any further. There's a strain or resentment out there, and you'll hear it on the job site, you'll hear it online. The foster parents are doing this for the check, man. And I understand where the suspicion comes from. People are skeptical of anyone who gets government payment attached to a child. But once you have actually seen the numbers, the suspicion falls apart on its own. Nobody's getting rich raising somebody else's traumatized 8-year-old for a few dollars a day. If you're doing this for the money, you're a scumbag. You've done the math wrong. You're worse than that. You have misunderstood what the payment is even for. It is not a wage for you. It is a reimbursement for the kid. And here's the part that matters the most when talking about dollar figure. If you're in it for money, you are not just financially confused, you are a danger to your child, and I'm calling you a scumbag. Because somewhere in that placement is a kid who has already had at least one adult in their life treat him as a transaction, as a checkbook, a burden to be managed instead of a person to be loved. The last thing that child needs is to land in a second home where the exact same math is running, just with the government writing the check this time instead of an absent parent. That is moral floor this whole episode stands on. A foster care, kinship care, respite care. None of it works as a business model, only works as a calling. Now, I want to be honest about exact financial reality because I've sat on a job site and had a guy said to me, man, you must be pulling in massive $7,000 paychecks from the government to house those kids. They must be paying your mortgage, your rent, car, everything, man. You're getting rich, bro. You just have to babysit those little brats. I look at him and I think, what world are you living in? Let's real numbers out there on the table. When my wife and I started doing the respite care, the daily rate was a flat $60 per child over 9 years ago. That rate crawled up to grand total, drum roll, to $67.30 today. That's it. In 9 years. So, sure, the system technically offers also 50 cents a kilometer driving allowance to transport it. So when you're driving a kid, they pay 50 cents per kilometer. But is such a bureaucratic hassle that we completely stopped claiming it years ago, unless we were driving some massive distance. So we just absorbed it. Because when a child enters your home, you aren't running the spreadsheets line item. You have to feed them properly, healthy food. You buy them endless snacks and crackers because these kids are constantly hungry. It's like, baby. You take them out in the world to explore and experience life. And because these children come from all walks of life, we made it a priority to honor their backgrounds. Whether it was taken from indigenous kids to local powwows, packing lunches for African community events, or just participating in traditional Canadian activities, made sure they stayed connected to their heritage and their people. We paid for that out of our pockets because we wanted them to feel seen, loved, and part of the community. You don't count pennies on child's identity, and the money doesn't pay for the emotional bandwidth. A spreadsheet doesn't cover what happens when a terrified child wakes up at 5 a.m. and is standing entirely unannounced inches from your face while you're dead asleep and screams out of pure raw fear because they don't know where they are. You open up your eyes to a kid in a panic asking, Alex, what are you doing? What's for breakfast? And first you absorb the screaming and everything else, and you instantly swallow your own exhaustion and try to calm down for a second and calm your racing heart, and you gently say, I'm just sleeping, buddy. It's 5 in the morning. Okay, let's go get some breakfast then. All the money government gives you is never, ever going to be enough to cover the kids that kind of toll. You do it because you choose to care, not because daily per diem makes sense on a balance sheet. Here's a fact that surprises almost everyone, including a lot of people who think they already understand foster care. Nearly half of the children in out of home care across Canada are not in a stranger's home at all. They're in kinship care, living with a grandparent, an aunt, an older sibling, a family friend that the court recognized as someone capable of stepping in. In Alberta specifically, recent provincial data has shown kinship and traditional foster placements running close to even. Roughly a third of kids in each, with the rest spread across other placement types. I think the public picture of Oscar is built almost entirely around strangers. Um, kid getting dropped in a house they never seen, with people they never met, and that does happen. We did plenty of it ourselves, but the more common story statistically is family doing everything it can to keep a child inside the family, just one ring further out than mom and dad. A grandmother in her 60s suddenly raising a 6 year old over again, an aunt rearranging her entire life because the alternative is her niece is going to a stranger. And there is something in that which connects directly to what this whole show has been building. Family isn't only the unit you were born into, it is a structure of people willing to absorb your bad luck as their problem. Kinship care is that instinct, formalized by the state because the state had to step in somewhere. But instinct itself, it's older than any of the paperwork. It is just people refusing to let a child become the stranger's responsibility while there is still blood or near enough to blood, willing to carry the weight. But let's speak the uncomfortable truth about how the system operates under the hood. I mean, it's normal. The government actively relies on kinship care by default because it is a massive cost saving measure for the province. They want to save money. They structurally distinguish between traditional foster care and kinship care so they can get away with paying extended families far less support, banking on the fact that the grandparents want to say no to their own blood. And because the system is broken, as always, we've seen the darkest side of it on a both the foster and kinship ends. We've seen placements where adults treat these kids purely as a meal ticket, using the child's funding to buy a better car or upgrade their own lifestyle while the kid goes without proper support. It's an absolute tragedy when a human greed infects a child's safety net. But more than anything, what we witnessed working along these placements was the sheer devastating exhaustion of the good people trying to hold it together. We had grandparents in their 60s and 70s pull up to our house to drop child off for respite weekend, looking at us with a pure gratitude, saying, "Thank you so much for watching them. You just desperately needed a little breath to survive." Think about that. You have elderly folks whose energy levels up, spend suddenly tasked with raising a 2 year old or 6 year old who is full of absolute fire, bouncing around in a living room like a basketball. Imagine that. These grandparents are doing everything they can, managing daycare, school runs, navigating complex systems. But many of these children have severe special needs. A 70-year-old grandmother is completely unequipped and unsupported to handle the violent outbursts or intense medical realities of a traumatized social needs toddler. They love them to death, but they are running on absolute empty. Our front door became the only pressure release while keeping these grandparents from structurally collapsing under the weight. I want to handle this part carefully because it is one of most podcasts either skip entirely or turn into something explorative. Trauma as entertainment. I'm not interested in either of those. I'm interested in being honest about what these children are actually carrying because you cannot understand foster care or respect the people doing it without understanding the weight that walks to the door with every single placement. In US system, which tracks this more rigorously than ours does in Canada, close to 9 in 10 children in foster care have experienced at least one significant trauma event before they ever enter a care. More than 40% come with a diagnosis, mental health condition already attached before the system has done anything to do to them or for them yet. And the most common reason children enter care in the first place is not dramatic version people picture. It is neglect more than any other single cause, followed by caregivers' substance use, then physical abuse, then domestic violence in the home. These are not, for the most part, children who did anything wrong. These are children who were born in circumstances they had zero say in. And the system's response removal is itself a second trauma layered on top of the first one, even when it's absolutely the right call. That is the part people miss. Just think about this. Even good removal, where you have a social worker, police come in, a necessary removal, a removal that almost certainly saved the child's life. It is still a rupture. The child does not experience it as a rescue in a moment. The experience is everything they had been taken away by adults without their consent again. And then they show up at your door. So, what that means practically for anyone doing this work is that you are not meeting a blank child. You are meeting a child who has already learned correctly based on every piece of evidence they have so far that adults leave, adults hurt, adults cannot be trusted to stay. And your job is not to argue with them out of that belief with the words. Your job is to be the evidence that proves it wrong, slowly, over time, by showing up exact same way every single day, whether they're easy to love that day or not. I want to be completely humble with you here. I was not a perfect foster parent, not even close. My wife and I made countless mistakes over these 9 years. There were times, situations caught us completely off guard. Times I didn't handle a trigger right way, and the moments where I simply did not comprehend the sheer depth of what these kids were carrying. It is almost impossible for healthy mind to fully grasp the horrors of severe physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal degradation. and the systematic starvation these children went through before hitting our doorstep. But there's one image that will haunt me and my wife and me for the rest of our days. And man, it broke our hearts. The tears more times than I can count. This is when a social worker or biological parent pulls up, opens their car, hands you a child whose entire life, everything they want in this world, has been crammed into a single black plastic garbage bag. Think about that utter lack of dignity is that. A devastated silent child standing in your front hallway holding that garbage bag, completely terrified because they have no idea if they're ever going back to place they call home. When you live with that level of trauma, your daily survival mechanics look like completely upside down to the outside world. We had kids who would sit at our table and eat the frantic, desperate speed, shoveling food in as if there was no tomorrow. Others were too paralyzed to even touch a plate, completely terrified that they were going to suddenly withhold food as a punishment because that was their lived normal upstream. We had children who honestly believed that normal discipline meant being locked in the dark room or thrown entirely out of the house into the cold. They thought that cruelty was just how life worked. Bedtime was a battlefield of fear. These kids couldn't close their eyes if the house went dark or quiet, because in their past, quiet meant predator or crisis was coming. To make them feel safe, we had to leave every bedroom door wide open, leave the hallway lights blaring, and keep a steady stream of background noise running. My wife and I spent countless nights sitting on the floor by their beds, reading stories for hours, just being as a physical shield of safety until their minds finally let them sleep. I have deep regrets about the things I could have handled better. By watching a child get triggered by something minor, watching their entire reality collapse into terror is the most heartbreaking thing you can witness. You realize very quickly that you can't lecture them out of the fear. You just have to open up your arms, offer unconditional hugs, love them with every ounce of soul you have, and provide the steady, unbroken safety they did not choose to lose. I want to bring it in on one specific condition now because it's almost never talked about outside of a clinical circles. And at the center of foster care in ways most people have no idea about it. It's called fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD. A landmark Manitoba study looked at children in care who had been identified with disability and found that roughly a third had a confirmed FASD diagnosis, with another sizable share suspect but not yet confirmed. You would have OCD, ADD, ADHD, uh, any letter you can include in there. When researchers ran the math across full population of children in care in that province, They estimated FASD prevalence in that population at around 113 per thousand, which works out roughly 13 times higher than the rate in the general population. Other provinces estimated for FASD among the kids in the care run anywhere from about 4% to over 10%. All of them well above general population rates. And researchers are clear that even those numbers are probably undercounts because FASD is chronically underdiagnosed. Here's why they matter so much for foster and respite families specific. FASD is invisible. For most kids who have it, there is no physical marker. What you get instead is a child whose brain process cause and effect time, consequences, and impulse control differently permanently because of parental alcohol exposure they had absolutely no control over. A child with FASD is not being defined when they cannot seem to learn from consequences you have explained 10 times. Their brain is wired differently around that exact loop. And because it is invisible, these kids get labeled constantly. Bad kid, lazy kid, manipulative kid, by teachers, by neighbors, sometimes by exhausted caregivers who do not have the diagnosis in front of them yet. It is one of the cruelest mismatches in the entire system. A permanent neurological condition treated by the world around the child as if they were a behavioral choice. The real world manifestation of this disorder is slow motion tragedy for these children. FASD acts like an invisible disease eating away at their brain's core wiring. It severely destroys their short term and long term memory processing. Through pure trial and error in our house, we had to face this head on. You can sit down with the child and spend hours patiently teaching them how to tie their shoelaces or how to truly brush their teeth. They will do the cleaning and think you made a breakthrough and you're like, woohoo! But then you wake up and the very next morning, they'll be looking at those same shoes or the toothbrush and not have a single clue what they were doing or what they even are. You can give them a direct, simple task, and 5 minutes later, their short term memory has completely wiped clean. It looks like defiance or laziness to an outsider, but it is a permanent mental challenge. Out of all the children who came to our home over 9 years, every single one of them suffered from FASD, actually, except maybe one. And it is a devastating reality. The most challenging part is the massive disconnect in development age. You can have a 15-year-old teenager standing in your kitchen, but mentally, emotionally, and cognitively, they're behaving exactly like an 8-year-old. They might try to do their homework or read a page, but their brain cannot comprehend the concepts or digest the numbers. When they officially turn 18 and the system prepares to cut them loose, their mental development is often permanently arrested between the ages 9 and 11. Think about the terrifying danger of that. You're releasing an individual with the mind of a 10-year-old into cutthroat financial world, predatory people who take brutal advantage of them because these kids cannot accurately comprehend right from wrong or read a dangerous situation. Because how disorder shifts the impulse control. They will look you dead in the eye and spin a massive lie about something you literally just watch them do. Not out of malice, but because their brain generally cannot process reality of the choice that they just made. And the world outside treats them like a fully capable adults who are just choosing to be bad. Other normal kids ruthlessly make fun of them because they can't comprehend that this teenager is essentially a real innocent baby kid trapped in a growing body. It is devastating in every single way, and it requires level of patience that forces you to throw standard parenting metrics completely out of the window. I want to close the data portion of this episode by widening the lens because foster care is not the same niche issue that nobody with the platform talks about. It runs through more famous lives than people realize. And it runs through Canadian politics in ways that are generally contested. Some of it admirable, some of it, well, real mess. Start with people who lived it. We're talking about Simone Biles, spent years in and out of the foster care as a young child. After her biological mother struggled with addiction before her grandparents formally adopted her. And she has been directly about it in public, talking about what it felt like to be, in her words, passed off and overlooked, like her words did not matter. And she has turned out into advocacy for foster youth and for greater investment in the system. And she became Olympic gold medalist in gymnastics. Cher, the famous singer, moved between foster care placements and children's home briefly as a child because of her mother's financial and health struggles. Tiffany Haddish has written and spoken openly about cycling through foster placements as a preteen after her mother's mental illness made the home unsafe, describing the specific terror of being dropped into strangers' house with zero information about who they were. On technology side, Steve Jobs' story starts with his birth mother placing him for adoption as an infant, a different track than foster care, but, but part of the same border story of the children whose path to a stable family ran through something other than biology. I mean, Steve Jobs became the owner of Apple, an amazing entrepreneur. And Colin Kaepernick was placed for adoption at birth and raised by adoptive parents after his biological father left before he was even born. None of these are tidy redemption stories where everything worked out because the person was special. They're evidence that rough starts through the system does not predetermine the ending, which is exactly the agency argument this episode is built on, not the political side. And here's why I want to be fair to both the credit and the criticism, and because both are real. In Canada, the data is impossible to look away from. Indigenous children make up roughly 8% of child population under 15, but more than half of all kids in the foster care nationally, and Alberta specifically. Recent figures have put it at around 74% of youth in the government care being Indigenous, against roughly 10% of youth population. That is not typo, folks. 74% of kids in care from 10% of the kids. A former federal minister of Indigenous Services, Jean Pilote, said publicly that the system is riddled with what she called perverse incentives. The funding flows to provinces based on how many kids get apprehended, which means the system can end up financially rewarded for pulling more children in rather than keeping families together. Figure that out. That is about as direct an institution critique as you will hear from someone who was inside government at the time. And on other side of the same debate, I Inuit member of parliament, I can't even pronounce this name to tell you the truth. Mumilak Chuaku. Yeah, I'm just gonna spell it out for the last name. Qaqqaq. This person stood up in the House of Commons and called a modern foster care system the new version of a residential school. I mean, this person is a bozo. A continuation under a different name of the same removal of indigenous children from their families and their culture. That is about as hard an accusation as it exists in Canadian politics. And it came from inside the parliament, not from outside of it. Now, we elected these people to go into politics, and this is what we're getting from. Figure that out. But I'm not going to resolve that debate for you in podcast segment. It is bigger than this episode. And people who have spent their entire careers in this fight disagree about exactly where the line falls between necessary protection and ongoing harm. But I think you need both of these in your head at the same time to actually understand and comprehend foster care in this country. It is simultaneously a system that saves individual kids' lives the way it saved some of the kids who came through our door, and a system with documented structural failures that fall hardest on the same communities over and over. But both of these things are true on the same Tuesday. And that structural failure is not just rhetoric, it has been tested and confirmed in the court. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled after 16-year legal fight led by children's advocate Cindy Blackstock that the federal government has been chronically underfunding child welfare services for First Nation kids living on reserve compared to what off-reserve kids receive. Discrimination, in tribunal's own words, the resulting settlement still being finalized, runs in tens of billions of dollars probably. That is not a think tank estimate of harm. That is a federal human rights tribunal putting a number on it. I don't want to leave this part only in the dark though, because there's a positive side worth naming too. Alberta runs a transitional support program called Advanced Futures, which funds post-secondary education for youth aging out of care. Since it started back in 2004, it has been supported thousands of former foster youth through certificates, diplomas, and degrees. It is not a fix for everything upstream, but is a real example government program built specifically around the cliff that these kids hit when they turn 18. Proof that when the resources and the will actually line up, the system can build a kid bridge instead of just dropping them off one. And there's new experiments worth watching because the thinking is finally starting to shift. Into 2024, Kansas became the first state in the United States to pass a brand new kind of legal permanency. They call it SOUL, SOUL family, designed for older teenagers and care. It lets a young person formalize a permanent legal connection to at least one caring adult while still keeping their foster care benefits. In other words, it stopped forcing a kid to choose between having a person and having support. Down in California, San Francisco, launching guaranteed income pilot for young people who had aged out of foster care. Regular unconditional cash payments of $1,200 a month, plus financial coaching for a year and a half. And squarely at the moment, these kids are mostly likely to fall into homelessness. Now, you can argue about guaranteed income as a policy all day long, and people on this show, our audience, will land in different places on it. I will definitely have Dr. Evelyn Forget talk about basic income and touch up on it and some of the foster care and trauma and psychological problems with people. But she does advocate on basic income, and you should be listening to her in the next episode. But what I find interesting is that underlying admission baked into both of these programs, the system is finally consenting that the cliff at 18 is a policy choice, not a law of nature, and a choice can be made differently. One more piece of context, because it matters for how you hold all of this. The US foster care population has actually been declining for 6 straight years, down from a peak of over 400,000 kids in 2020 to roughly 329,000 as of late of 2024. That is real and is partially the result of deliberate efforts to keep more families together and find permanency faster. This is not a story, everything gets worse forever. It is a story of the system that is genuinely, slowly improving in some measurable ways while still failing like badly in others, especially for indigenous kids in this country. Both of those can be true. Holding both of them at once is the only honest way to look at this. I want to bring this all the way home now. And to do it, I have to take you back to where episode 5 ended. Because this episode is a proof that thing episode 5 argued. In episode 5, I made a case that every generation before us passed something forward that was not money. A way of seeing the world, a framework for meeting hard times, a set of values you absorb at a kitchen table before you were even old enough to know you're absorbing them. That inheritance, argued, is the most durable form of wealth. There is more durable than money, more durable than poverty, because it survives every crisis that takes the rest away. Foster care is what happens when that inheritance is deliberately interrupted. There is no family passing values forward at a table. There's no generational wisdom waiting at home. For a lot of these children, the system itself becomes the only thing standing in the gap where that inheritance should have been. They are the test case for the entire argument. If agency is real, if a person can still build something meaningful even when the conditions are stacked against them, then it has to be real here, under the worst conditions this show can describe, or it isn't real anywhere. And that data on what happens when the gap goes unfilled is brutal. In US, which tracks this better than we do, somewhere between roughly a fifth and a third of young people aging out of foster care experience homelessness during the transition to adulthood, against a lifetime rate of about 4% in general population. Over 40% are incarcerated by age 20. Only about half are employed by the age 24, and somewhere around 8 to 12% earn a college degree, against roughly half of the general population. Now imagine that. Every one of these numbers is a kid who hit 18, sometimes 19, in a place with extended care and walked out the door of the only family structure they had ever known into nothing. But here's the entire reason I brought this episode back to episode 5. Some of these kids built extraordinary lives anyway. Simon Biles did it. Plenty of kids who came through our own front door, kids I'm never going to name or detail on a podcast, went on to build real lives. Not because the odds were good, the odds were terrible. They built anyway because somewhere along the line, somebody refused to let them become a statistic without a fight. That is the agency in its rawest possible form. Not a motivational poster about a grit. People, man, actual human beings choosing to keep building a life under the worst conditions this episode can name. And think back to where we opened this whole hour. That a few dollars a day stipend. There's honesty in that number that I keep coming back to, because it strips away every excuse and every cynical theory about why a person would do this. Nobody is doing foster care or kinship care or respite care for the payout. If you are, you're a scumbag. I'm telling you right now. If you're doing this, you're the biggest scumbag there is. They're doing it because somewhere along the line, they decided that a child who did not choose any of this deserved one adult who would choose them back with nothing in it for themselves except the outcome. That is not charity in the soft, performative sense people usually mean by the word. That is the hardest, least glamorous version of showing up that exists. And it happens quietly in thousands of houses across this country every single night, with almost nobody watching and almost nobody keeping score. Let me do what this show always does at the end. Let me give you the specific version of what you can actually do with all of this. Because an argument that never lands in an action just becomes one more thing you agreed with and then forgot. If you ever quietly wondered whether you could foster, look into Respite first. It is one ramp almost nobody talks about. You're not committing to raising a child for years. You are giving an existing foster family the weekend that keeps them from breaking. It is real. It is needed. And bar to start the conversation with an agency is a lot lower than you think. If fostering is not where you are in life, support the people who do it. The respite families, the kinship grandparents, the aunt who took in 3 kids should not plan on a meal, an afternoon of childcare, knowing their names. These are at least supported caregivers in the system, and they're most likely to burn out. And the difference between a family that lasts and a family that quits is often just whether anyone showed up for them. And pay attention to the kids aging out. The cliff at 18 is the single most preventable tragedy in this whole story. A former foster youth who has one stable adult in their corner at 19 has a completely different life than the one who has nobody. That stable adult is not a heroic role. It is a phone that gets answered, a door that stays open, a person who keeps showing up after the system has officially stopped being required. The system is broken in places we documented today. The over representation is real. The funding failures are real, and the tribunal put a number on that. None of that changes what is available to you. A child who didn't choose any of this. And the specific, unglamorous, irreplaceable decision to be one adult, that is moral economy applied to the people with the very least. And it starts with exactly the people listening to this right now. 9 years of respite care still doing it. Kids in crisis, kids between the homes, kids the system had nowhere else to put. That is where this episode came from. Not a research paper, a front hallway, and a phone that kept ringing, and the decision my wife and I made over and over again for almost a decade. If you take one thing out of this hour, let it be this. Foster care is the clearest test. There is the thing this whole show believes, that you still have agency, even when the inheritance was interrupted, even when conditions are bad as conditions get. The kids prove it, the caregivers prove it, and nobody's getting paid enough to fake it. This show is going to keep growing from here. The solo arc, I gave you the framework, the feeling, the map, the culture, the system, the response, and now this. From here, we start bringing in the voices that can extend the conversation in ways I can't do alone. People who have studied those systems professional, people who have lived inside them, people who built something worth having out of conditions that were working against them. Subscribe to Moral Economy Talk so you don't miss what is coming. And if this one moved something in you, if you have if you know someone who fosters, or someone who has fostered, or someone quietly wondering where they could whether they could, send it to them. Not for the show. I don't care. Because they deserve to know that somebody sees the work. That they is that is where the community we are trying to build starts. One conversation at a time. Because money shapes how we live. Our values decide who we be. This is Moral Economy Talk. I'm your host, Aleksandar Balta, and I will see you in the next episode.